So thank you for staying with us. The panel that we have now is one I'm particularly excited about. It's for advancing ideas in South Asia. These are students and scholars who have a connection with the Mittal Institute, fellows who've been funded through grants by the Mittal Institutes, and one student who's been funded by one of our Seed for Change grants. You'll hear all about that. I'm going to let colleague Parimal take over. Parimal is the moderator. He's an old friend, so actually I'm older, so he's a young friend of an older me. Parimal is, I have to say, because I've known him for 30 years now, he is one of the world's leading Sanskritists of the younger generation, if I might say so, since I'm older. An extraordinary scholar. He is the chair of the South Asian Studies Department. Under his leadership, that department has been reconstituted in the way that it should be. He is also a philosopher. I'm just going to mention a couple of his books just to put him in context, and then I'll let him take over. So Against the Hindu God, it's a book-length work on Buddhist epistemology and the philosophy of language and mind that supports it. His more recent books include Why Metaphors Are Not a Source of Knowledge and Freedom in Pre-Modern India, Why Metaphors Are Not a Source of Knowledge, and Damit in India, in addition to much writing on Buddhist literature, Sanskrit literature, literary theory, and almost every branch of South Asian philosophy, ancient and some medieval and a little modern. So Parimal, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Hitesh. With the exception of me, this panel is the panel of the future. It's the panel made of very wonderful young scholars who are working on a wide range of materials from South Asia, and I'm really happy to be here to learn from all of you and also to introduce you. So just a bit about the format before we get started and before I introduce them. Each of our speakers will just speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and the idea is to really introduce their work, who they are, a bit about their project. And then we will, after all the presentations, hopefully each will have a question or two for the other, or I may have a question for them, and we'll talk amongst ourselves for a little while as a way of sort of jogging your memory or inspiring certain thoughts so you two can be in conversation with all of us. We mean this to be informal and meaningful and not a performance. So I probably, if there's something that happens in the middle that you really have a question, I think you should also feel free to interrupt and say, I didn't get that, could you repeat that? And that's fine, just so we get the spirit of this stand. That's what this is all about. That's how it was advertised to all of you, I trust. Okay. So I'll introduce our speakers in the order they're going to speak, if that's okay. The first is Ajmalkhan. Ajmal is a Raghunathan Fellow, and he holds a PhD in developmental studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India. The next speaker is going to be Mariam, who is the Syed Babar Ali Fellow, and she, when she's not here, is teaching as assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the Lahore School of Economics. Our third speaker is going to be Kheya Furtado, who's the Bajaj Visiting Research Fellow, and she ordinarily is teaching at the Goa Institute of Management in India. And our final speaker is Gauri Nagpal, who is a graduate student at Harvard who's graduating this term. And she is in the School of Design. One thing that all of our speakers have in common is three of them are from South Asia. And them being here is directly due to the generosity of the Mittal Institute and specific donors who had the wisdom to say, look, one of the things that we need is to bring people from the region to Harvard as a way of enriching the way we understand things, and also hopefully we can contribute in some small way to their scholarship in the future of our field. And the other very generous thing that has happened is through the Seeds of Change Fund, we've been able to support the work of some of our own students, and that's what Gauri is doing here. So before I turn it over to them, please join me in welcoming all of them, both to campus now. So Ajmal, I think you get to begin.
Thank you. So
you get to press the button.
Thank you so much, Professor Parimal, and thank you so much for having me here. So I have a problem of like my throat in the morning since, So like what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit out and then I'm going to do the rest. Yeah. So as we meet here in Boston, most part of South Asia is experiencing one of the hottest summers along with heat waves. Though the last year, Delhi recorded the highest ever recorded temperature, this year's summer deaths came early. In India's financial capital, 13 people died and more than 500 people were hospitalized out of sunstroke in an open-air award event in the ground in the Kargar area of Navi Mumbai. Out of extreme weather events alone, and only between the 70s to 2019, as many as 1.5 lakh people died out of heat waves, cold waves, floods, lightning, tropical cyclones. And in the last year alone, in 2022, every day, India had an extreme weather event that claimed more than 3,000 lives and affected 1 million hectare of crops. Now, like, of course, we have been talking about climate change in that sense, and none of us are free from the impacts of climate change in that sense. Now, this creates unprecedented socioeconomic and political challenges, as South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, with largest share of the poor people in the world, whose major share is dependent on natural resources for survival. On the other hand, these communities still protect the environment. For example, 5% of the world's total population of the indigenous people, Adivasis in India, protect 80% of Earth's biodiversity in the forest, deserts, grasslands, and the marine environment in which they have lived for centuries. Now, my research is centered around this crisis, where we are more or less in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. Globally, climate justice emerged as a major framework acknowledging the disproportionate burden experienced by the countries and communities that are least responsible for the anthropogenic climate change. However, climate justice within countries that are most unequal societies in the world, such as India, has not yet gained enough attention in the climate change policy and scholarship. My project looks at climate justice within India, considering caste and the Adivasi identity as two central socio-ecological hierarchies in the subcontinent. Based on the ethnographic field work that I conducted before I joined at Harvard, among the Adivasi and Dalit farmers in the world's largest area of mangroves forest in the Bay of Bengal in Sundarbans and the Kutnad Delta region in the South India, I try to demonstrate the limits of universal frameworks of climate justice in regions of South Asia. I kind of then push and ask how unique forms of injustice, inequalities, and their multiple intersections and those intertwined socio-ecological relations determine and mediate the experience of climate change in India. I then like sort of argue that South Asia might need an alternative climate justice frameworks that are informed by the complexities within, such as caste as well as the Adivasi communities. And these complexities will have to be informed by our climate change mitigation and the adaptation policies in South Asia. So I sort of pay much closer attention to these two complexities which I was talking about, the question of caste and how caste is intimately is an ecological category or a climate category or a category of vulnerability in the experience of changing climate, and how do the category of an indigenous population or Adivasi also similarly hold like similar categorization in that sense in the experience of climate change. So yeah, so this is like broadly like the kind of work that I'm kind of doing. And yeah, and this particular space, in that sense, where I this particular fellowship, as well as Harvard as a place, has been a great experience for me to sharp my thoughts, my own arguments, what I'm like trying to build out of my field work, and also like coupled with the best minds who are like working on some of the similar questions elsewhere in the world, along with experts on the science of climate change, and also histories of like environmental histories of the planet, in that sense, was the striking thing which I was able to benefit from being here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mariam.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. Post-lunch sessions, kind of drowsy. Is that better now? Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so I'm the Syed Babar Fellow at the Mittal Institute, and I'm here working on a translation of a book of literary theory from Urdu into English. And I work broadly on religious orientation, storytelling, and the concept of the uncanny as theorized by Sigmund Freud in 1919. And I look at these concepts through Dastan-e-Amir Hamza. And I'm hoping that some of you have heard about the Dastan. If you've not, think the Arabian Nights to just get an idea of what the world of the Dastan looks like. So this is, as I like to call it, an ahistorical, religious story about Prophet Muhammad's uncle, Hamza, who was famously martyred at the Battle of Uhud. His body was cut up into 70 pieces and his heart and liver chewed by Hinda, who was fulfilling the vow to avenge her father's death a year earlier at the hands of Hamza. But before I go into the details of that, I just want to talk a little bit about resilience and resiliency as the topic of today's symposium. And I kind of got this habit from my supervisor, who would always go to the Oxford English Dictionary to look at the meaning of each and every word he'd encounter. And I realized again and again that if you go back to how words are used, you will see a way of how they connect to how you tell stories. And I would like to use the word resilience as that thread that combines all of my work that I've done earlier and I do now and I hope to do in the future, not least with how it relates to the concept of fate and patience, about how we have to wait and see what the world or God or fate has in store for us. And apparently the first use of the word resilience comes from Sir Francis Bacon in his A Natural History, and he uses it in the sense of rebounding or coming back, the ability, he says, of materials to return to their original shape after being compressed or stretched. And my work was and remains the first book-length study of the one-volume English translation of Dastan-e-Amir Hamza. And it was an eye-opening experience. This is a rich world where the longest version of the story is 46,000 pages long. It goes back to the 7th century. It was put in miniature painting folios, very famously by the Mughal Emperor Akbar, as a representation of everything that he held very dear to him, arts and culture on the one end, but also a fanciful, imaginative culture and religious tradition, which we are very, very, we in the subcontinent, in the greatest sense, including Iran and the greater Persian world, we find ourselves at this crossroad of where all religions and all cultures, it became like a melting pot. And the book I'm currently translating as part of my project here at Mittal is looks at how the one reason why Dastane-Amir Hamza never endured the test of time, despite the fact that it's the longest, most sought after, the most happening set of stories, is because of colonization. And he looks at how, because the British thought that this here is a story that can actually give competition to the British ideas about divide and rule, that we have this storytelling which doesn't look at religion as a dividing or a binary. It looks at religion and culture as one greater whole, and it tells stories that bring all of these concepts together. And I feel we have a lot to learn today from how storytelling can be used to build this kind of resilience, this kind of hope that we really need in our world today. And I would like to talk about how diversity in and of itself is resilience, and to go back to these stories that have stood the test of time, artworks, which I should say a little bit more about because they exemplify resilience as far as I'm concerned. It was 1,400 miniature paintings, out of which 126 survived, and they've survived through being plastered on the walls of shops along Lake Dull to prevent water from seeping in. They're now at the Victorian Albert Museum. They're at MAC in Vienna. They lived through that, and they lived through a lot of ravages. And we're trying to bring those fragments back and talk about how they've stayed and are resilient, and maybe we can take something and move forward. And last but not the least, I want to talk about bilingualism and translation, and how bilingual scholars have this responsibility to transfer and transpose context. And I sometimes feel bad about the fact that we're not doing this in Urdu, in indigenous languages. But at the same time, I feel that if we were not to translate, we would be remiss actually in never letting this, the lid off. And, the world needs another greater Arabian Nights, doesn't it? Who wants more Aladdins and, all the stuff like that. And again, my last comment is about thinking about uncertainty as power, as resilience, and that if we can, in the moment of storytelling or life or culture, or when we talk about resilience, take this, famously, talked, Rudyard Kipling talked about this, and if you can, let the, forgive for that last minute before you make a decision. It's like living in that moment and being resilient enough to think about uncanniness, or that space which exists between the two extremes, and look at how we can build ourselves up, looking at how fate treats us, how we don't know what's going to happen in the next moment, and just live as a culturally diverse, unified whole, South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kheya.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. From that really exciting world that Mariam so artistically narrates always, and fascinates everyone with all of that. I'm sorry, I have to bring you down to what I'm going to talk about. I think the morning panel before lunch really set up very well, what I do. If I were to summarize my work in one statement, it would really be, I'm trying to look for answers of what's the best way to engage with the private sector in India for achieving health system goals, and more specifically for universal health coverage. And because the goals of a health system and universal health coverage pretty much align. Universal health coverage is not necessarily a program or a scheme, it's a goal for a health system. And so I've been working within the context of the Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, which is the long name for our publicly financed health insurance program that was launched in 2018. This is, a program that provides insurance cover and hospitalization access to the bottom 40% of the population. And what I've been looking at really is implementation experiences, but focusing really on these two models of purchasing, the organization of purchasing in ABPMJ, which is through government directly or through the private sector, which is through private insurance intermediaries, and comparing really what that looks like. We focused a lot on the outcomes of such programs globally, but we've not really looked at how care is organized, how purchasing is organized, and therefore what really brings about these outcomes. And that's really what I've been looking at. But importantly, what happens in India, and the panel talked about this, is that we have a mixed health system where, and mixed health systems are not unique to India. India is a great example of them, but they are in many low and middle income countries have similar systems where you have out-of-pocket expenditure that really finances most of healthcare. You have a publicly financed and delivered healthcare system that coexists with a privately financed market-based health system. And so really, the question is, how do you bring these together? Now, in India, we have a large private sector, not just in the area of delivery, but also in terms of the supply side. So an industry, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare IT, these are very good platforms. These are great resources. It is part of the Indian health system, but unfortunately, in the public health discourse and in the discourse on health systems, we've tended to sort of stay away from this question of how to engage with the private sector. Most of our debates become ideological, and the panel also talked about schisms in, should it be public, should it be private? But the reality is it's a very mixed system. Most people use the private sector, you saw the data. And so how can we best engage? We have to have answers on what aspects of the private sector do we engage with and how? We're not saying that we have to, everybody needs to use the private sector, all publicly financed care needs to sort of pay the private providers, but the nuances of that. And that's really the kind of gap in research that I'm trying to fill. A lot of the work, and presented a seminar 2 weeks ago, which was on this private insurance intermediaries. We have a large resource of private insurers, and can they be contracted by government to fulfill supply side constraints? Many states aren't able to set up large government trusts to purchase healthcare. So they contract out insurance companies. Evidence earlier has shown us that there can be perverse incentives because there's a misalignment of incentives between the public and the private sector. So are the insurance companies curbing utilization of care? Are they preventing access to care for the people? And what are the contract and governance terms really that oversee all of these arrangements? And I find in my research that where states are really undercapacitated, they can contract insurance companies as well, as long as these contracts are designed in such a way that there are limited functions which are contracted out to the insurance company. So the insurance companies serve well to manage financial risk if you keep a cap on their administrative costs. So you don't incentivize them to sort of minimize claim payouts, have very large profits. You keep a cap on administrative costs. And we see that when you do that, there really isn't much of a difference in utilization between trust-run states and private insurance-run states. However, there are perverse incentives in that there might be, the publicly financed insurance is actually one of the largest markets for the insurance companies. And so these companies are very incentivized to bid for these contracts. And sometimes they do it at untenable premium rates. And so therefore, many companies agree to do these projects in PMJ as well, they bid very low contract rates, and then they're unable to sustainably manage that risk. Okay, and this is something that we've been looking at. We've been suggesting to states to come up with actuarially calculated premium rates that can really help minimize this kind of perverse incentive coming in and the scheme collapsing in itself. So that's one area of work. Now, when it comes to financing globally, the evidence is quite clear. Publicly financed care produces the most equitable outcomes and gives the highest benefits in terms of financial risk protection. But what about delivery? And that's the sticky point, really. So research in, say, Europe, where all countries provide universal health coverage, shows us that countries with even a very small private sector to a balanced public-private to a very high dominant private sector, all these countries are able to provide UHC services, whether it's for primary care, whether it's for hospital services, whether it's for specialist services. So really, and high levels of patient satisfaction accompanying that. So the question is not really, can it be done? The question is, how do they do it? And what really happens there is a very strong governance and stewardship of the health system through these contractual arrangements, through deciding what functions does the private sector take care of and what functions does the government take care of. And that's what I'm trying to now sort of dissect in this work that I'm doing here within, again, the context of the PMJ. My first work in this was actually during my PhD when I tried to engage private providers in a very basic public health function, which was disease surveillance. And that taught me two very important lessons. The first lesson is I had to set up a surveillance system and include private providers because most patients were going to the private sector. And the disease numbers that were getting reported for a pandemic, and this was happening back in H1N1 2009, still happening during COVID-19, where all our case numbers were coming from public providers. We just didn't have data from the private sector. And so when I went about setting up the surveillance system, I realized that we didn't have any data on who was the private sector. Where were they? What kind of services were being provided? So how do you set up a system when you don't know who the private sector is? And so I had to spend the first year of my field work just walking the streets and GPS mapping every private provider in the area, and then set up an intervention and then test it for 2.5 years to figure out what is the effect, how do you do it, what are the barriers and facilitators to getting the private sector into this, and then how does that impact case detection and all your public health outcomes. And so the first lesson is, where's the data on who's the private sector? Within Ayushman Bharat, more than half of all providers are in the private sector. But we just contract them. We don't know why those people are there. We see that of those, about 45% are private. Of them, most of them are small, mid-sized hospitals, not accredited. Why do we have these hospitals? Is it because they're the only ones where the incentives align, or is it because we just don't have the means to bring in the large corporate hospitals into the game? So the first thing is getting the right kind of data on what constitutes the private sector, and then trying to understand what incentives work for the private-public engagement in Ayushman Bharat. And then the second question is really looking at the outcomes of care in terms of the empanelment. What critical supply side capacities is the private sector in PMJ fulfilling in this program? All right. And trying to do this in the context of different markets. A very important part of my work here is really to look at India from the context of different markets. Not all states are the same. Tripura, the union territories have no private sector. Tripura, 2% private sector. Haryana, 77% private sector. So I'm trying to create these market types and characterize public-private engagement within these market types in the context of PMJ, which is really our central strategy for UHC in India. And I'll stop there. I know I've been talking too much. I just want to say that, being at Mittal and this fellowship has really been one of the most amazing things, because a lot of the work that I do, I come from a public health epidemiology biostats training, and then I've moved into health systems work and a lot of work that actually health economists do. And I've done this through self-study and reading the amazing work of lots of academics. Well, now I've been able to meet them, chat with them about my work, audit their classes. And I think that's been the most amazing experience. Have them comment, help me use different frameworks, look at these questions differently. And I hope to carry on these collaborations as well with people from the Commission, Atlantic Commission, and great community for which I'm extremely grateful, and hope to be able to carry on the work in collaboration. So thank you very much.
Final speaker before our conversation is Gauri.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're on. You have some slides, right?
Yes. My name is Gauri Nagpal. I'm a graduate student at the School of Design, and I'm studying design studies and urban planning. And this project is part of my thesis, which I'm to defend in a week's time. It essentially started in 2020 with this image. And this is the image of one of the largest migrations we've seen in the subcontinent since partition. It was after the first lockdown in 2020, and we had informal workers from major megacities, urban centers, move back and start walking back to villages. And it was because the cities just could not provide livelihood or social protection. And it was a condition in which they weren't walking 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. They were walking up to 700, 800, and some up to 1,000 kilometers, simply because urban planning, urban systems, urban social protection in our cities failed in a very, very big way. This is an image from the 50s from my home city of Chandigarh. And this project is essentially about one of 6 categories of informal workers, which are market traders or street vendors. And this kind of image, particularly in the context of Chandigarh, which is a very, very modernist, highly bureaucratized city, is seen as a major, major problem, and it's heavily regulated. And a lot of that comes from certain laws that were sort of inherited from colonial systems, which speak of bodily propriety. Somehow, because in the 1800s, in Victorian England, it became shameful to eat in public. Those laws started being implemented in Mumbai and then sort of proliferated in the rest of the subcontinent. So who feeds our city? 8 out of 10 urban workers in India are employed in the informal sector. Registered street vendors are estimated about 10 million, and these are official figures which are deeply sort of miscalculated, that a lot of civil society organizations say, and 83% are still unregistered. They're mostly men between the ages of 30 to 50 with very little formal education. Establishments are split equally between mobile and immobile structures, and they have very, very limited access to formal financial institutions and formal credit. So what are the challenges? In 2014, a livelihood protection law was passed at the center. And this was a very, very progressive law. It came after sort of years of civil society mobilization from organizations such as SEVA and WEGO and NASWI, National Hawkers Federation. But alongside the pandemic, there were 2 certain amendments made that turned a lot of these informal workers and their operations completely illegal overnight. One of those was that each and every street apparatus, nothing could be fastened to the ground. That's what the official law says. And the second, that every cart or redi needs to fit between a 5 feet by 6 feet space. And none of the current carts on the street can, including circulation space for the street vendor, can sort of abide by this law. And just because that was written into law, everything overnight became illegal. So I was in 2020 still in Chandigarh when I started my degree, and I was going to school at GST at midnight doing online courses, but also in Chandigarh during the day, and working with street vendors sort of figured out this quick hack to sort of, just slice the front wheel and fold it at a 90-degree angle so that it could just fit between a 5x6 area, so that they could sort of continue their operations without having the threat of eviction for like a 100 rupee fix. And so then this sort of idea progressed further and further as to how to sort of make a vehicle sort of speak to local conditions. And we sort of added a lot of like different modular features, like, a slab and then a different slab that goes on top, but nothing is like permanent and nothing is strictly fastened to the structure. And you can sort of, if like a cop comes, you basically just like collapse it and kind of run away. And like, if you need to sort of figure out ways to sort of be very, very mobile in very, very quick conditions. And so this was when we first took out the first vehicle we had in the city, and we just got like vegetables from somebody on the street, and we're like, can we try this out? And so this was the first vehicle that was built completely by street vendors, and I was just sort of facilitating and making design interventions with them. This was the first design. And then second, we were like, okay, now let's electrify it. Let's try to go a little faster. And so what we did was we took apart basically a golf cart from the golf course and tried to sort of find a way to retrofit the motor to a traditional Indian street cart. And what the reason for doing that was that how do you create something that speaks to local conditions, local material, but is also affordable? Because these are not, for it to be sustainable, for it to be long-term as an intervention in the city, it needs to be very, very affordable by the vendors. And so I think one very important shift in our imagination was how do you upgrade instead of building from scratch, instead of building new? How do you repair? How do you center these ideas instead of, creating something from scratch? And so we had like two like chain systems so that, okay, if I don't have money 1 month to charge it, I can still sort of keep going, which a lot of electric vehicles don't currently afford. So it's mechanical and electrical. There's a music system, central locking, it's like a proper car. And this is the first time we sort of took it out in the streets. We passed it, past like cop cars, everything, nobody stopped us, which was a big relief. And then and this was just sort of like a rudimentary pricing model of like constantly sort of upgrade. Okay, if I have sort of accumulated enough capital, I'll add another, table, I'll then electrify it, I'll do all these things. And using the Seed for Change grant, thankfully to Professor Tarun and Professor Hathi, we were able to build this January a full fleet of 16 vehicles. And this is how they sort of run in the city. So we had our first formal fleet, which was then approved by the mayor of the city. And now we hope they want to sort of take it up as an independent project, create a model vending zone by the end of the year. And we're sort of figuring out how to go about that. And this was a really, really, really rewarding experience. And thank you very much for the Institute for supporting it.
Thank you. Wow, you all are going to be so excellent. You even kept to time, which, as you know, is one of the greatest difficulties for academics. You're setting a very high bar for all of us already. I wanted to thank you all so much. As you can all see, it's an incredibly rich and diverse array of materials, questions, of problems, and of ways of approaching it. And so I thought maybe as a way of just starting, I would ask you 2 questions, the same 2 questions, and you can choose to answer one or both, or ignore them and just give me a good answer to a question I should have asked you. That's fine too. So I thought maybe I would just start by asking these 2 questions. What does success in your scholarship look like to you? That's question 1. And the second is, we've all had the pleasure of listening to you. Is there one thing that you would like us to leave thinking based on what you have told us? I just thought 2 general questions to get us started, and we can all jump in, of course. So, were they unfair questions? Maybe. Okay. I told you can give a good answer to the question I should have asked as well. So please go ahead. You can start anywhere you'd like. Would you like to start? Or anyone who'd like to start can start. It's informal, remember, we're not performing here. So
for me, for me, the way in which how we look at inequality in India in terms of the experience of like climate change would be one of the striking thing. Like, for example, India as a country has been the forerunner for the global climate justice, actually. I mean, like a lot of literature came from India. Like Indian scholars challenged the like World Resources Institute's like claims about like per capita global carbon emissions, actually. So one of the way I would think if I have to make an impact in that sense was to think about like a lot of like along with the global inequalities, we also start thinking about the internal inequalities that include Dalit communities, Adivasis, workers, pastoral communities, urban poor.
I'll just interrupt here. What will that do for us? You're spending so much time rightly thinking and looking at the ways in which climate injustice disproportionately affects different communities. And particularly you want us to focus on, let's say, Adivasi communities or lower caste communities. What do you think having a fine-grained understanding of the differential impacts will do for us? I take it that's the success of the scholarship, is really making us understand differential impact. Is that fair? So suppose you succeeded. What will that do for us going forward, do you think?
I mean, I'm not sure if I will like succeed in that sense, but like, for example, like one of the examples that I can think now of, like, for example, I was part of the team which was like formulating climate action plan for the city of Bombay, actually. Now, one of the way, like in which how I could do this was through this team. Like, for example, this team had no idea who are the Koli fishing communities in the city. Now, if you don't know about one of the central ecologically connected communities of your own city, how are you going to make some of these plans which would like eventually or are at the forefront of these kind of impacts? So some of those are the kind of things that I would primarily think about, the kind of change, both in terms of thinking about it as in like scholarship as well as policy, is like something that I am like trying to push from with like my own scholarship and the other interventions.
Excellent, thanks, that's perfect. Go next.
Hey, so thank you for those questions. I was asked that question earlier this morning about how I look at my future, and I thought about how I've stopped making long-term plans. And I just think of the next thing that's coming up and that excites me, and I kind of go with the flow. Then I think that's the only way to deal in any reasonable way with life. But if I were to really think about what success would look like, I would kind of go back to thinking about what my next plan is supposed to be. I'm planning to translate a 10-volume version of Dastan-e-Mir Hamza, which is for children, which is a version that I read as an 8-year-old, which is the version because of which I'm doing what I do today, despite the fact that no one in the world wants to do it. It is because it gave me that pleasure that it gave an 8-year-old. So if I can give back to children who are not reading in Urdu anymore, if I can give back to them in English little books that talk about the same characters that they're interested in, one day maybe we have a set of scholars who are looking at the Urdu stories as much as they're looking at the English stories. And I think it's very important to look at indigenous storytelling traditions. They give us so much more. And thinking about the future, that's, again, a very interesting question. And I look at how, if there's one thing that I think each one of us in today's world needs to think about, where it's becoming increasingly difficult to talk about anything without getting backlash. It can be something very simple or something very complex, but we are really in that process, culling debate. So we have our own sets of what we consider blasphemy, and we can be killed for it. And I think storytelling has a very important place. And if we can tell our children or ourselves as adults that we can tell stories in these spaces which are not, which aren't supposed to be taken very seriously, but at the same time, it has lessons for how we look at life and existence and us as the world, like climate and health, like big things. They're all really stories we need to tell ourselves about ourselves. If I were to use Clifford Keats's, brilliant kind of formulation about what cultures are like. So, yeah.
Right. So thanks for that question. And this is really something that's that I'm always asking myself as well, because I think so. When I was doing my PhD and I finished my master's. I started to work, and I always knew I wanted to be in policy and be able to move the needle on real change on the ground. But I knew I needed to get a PhD so that I could have the research tools to develop evidence-based policy, because that's what my training and during my master's was, that policy should be evidence-based, and to create evidence you need to have research tools. And so I thought, okay, a PhD is really important for that, and that's why I did the PhD. And straight out of my PhD, I went and worked with the Planning Commission, the then Planning Commission of India, which is now the Niti Aayog, and I was there exactly when that transition happened. And that was really, for me, a great experience, because everything that I had been sort of training for, I could use in that space to contribute, to policy work. And I think that has remained for me the motivator, really. Even having moved back into academia, my research, I've been fortunate enough to be able to do this work in collaboration with the national government and with state governments, with the WHO, as a technical and funding for technical advice and funding support. And so this very close research that's rooted within the health system with all of these partners, for me, is really important, because then that sort of creates the space where you can move the needle on change. And so, the research questions and a lot of the work I've done so far have actually come from the policymakers. And then, we work with them through the process, and we present our findings, and we provide recommendations that, and it's not easy. It's not easy to do research, with government. There's lots of challenges there. And sometimes, even if you want to advance your scholarship, you want to do something really like, path breaking, and you want 3 years to do it, and they'll say, do it in 4 months. That's all you've got. So that creates constraints. But I think at the end of the day, the fact that we can work with them and give them findings that help, course correct a program like this, like the Ayushman Bharat, even in a small way, I think it really sort of, for me, that becomes success really in scholarship. And that's what I hope to be pursuing in whatever projects I take up. So, yeah.
Thanks.
I think if I think of something that everybody can take away, it would basically be that place matters, and where you ask questions from matters. And I think I've noticed this a lot, especially in the urban planning program, even at the GST. And I was like, why am I only reading about Chicago? Why am I only reading about Paris? Why am I reading about these cities that ask very, very different questions? Why am I not thinking of, like, I don't know, the Kolkata model of urban planning, or the Mumbai model, or the Sao Paulo model, or any of these other sort of geographies that haven't been represented as much in scholarship? And I think with writing more from these places opens up newer imaginations. And I think that would be nice to see reflected in curriculum as well.
That's great, thanks. We have a lot of time for questions, so why don't we just open it up, and you could also welcome to raise your hands and ask questions of each other too. That's fair. So, better.
So I have a bit of an open-ended question. Anybody can answer. Not everybody has to answer either. So, which is in your time at Harvard. I think most of you are here for a year. Well, you're here for a year also, yeah. And Mariam, you're here for 6 months, yeah. What is, what's an interesting non-South Asia influence on your work? Because that's part of being in a big university, or a non-discipline, something from outside your discipline that has influenced the way you think about it. If anything occurs to you, and again, if it doesn't, you don't need to answer.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is while I also study this sitting where I am, but I audited, like Professor Yip is my mentor, and she teaches a course on comparative health systems. And so, and in that classroom, there are people from all over the world, right? And we're all, we're analyzing health systems across the world, high income countries, as well as low and middle income, but a lot of focus is on high income countries. And so I think for me, that was a great sort of perspective to be able to draw ideas, draw evidence from other settings that can help address some of the questions in South Asia and really think much broader than what you do. And I think it's the discussions more for people who've lived in those countries and who have those experiences, because a lot of it you can read, but you can't sort of connect on the level you can when you're in the classroom with them. And I think that has been, that's just one. I'm sure there are a lot of others.
Thank you for that question, actually. So for me, it's kind of the other way around, because I've always been at departments of English literature and language. I did my MA there, I did my other MA there, and then my PhD in critical theory. Everything was done at departments of English, language, and literature. And Harvard has, for the first time, given me this opportunity to be in like a department, a place that looks at South Asia the way we do here. And I think Professor Ali Hassani's mentorship has really helped me think through those concepts that I'd sometimes struggle with talking to somebody. So my professor in England he's a very famous critical theorist working on Freud and the uncanny. But when I would talk about the Islamic or the South Asian or the subcontinental experience of stories, I would have to grapple with all of those questions myself. And I think that has been for me really helpful. On another note, I've been talking about to my friends here about how fate is kind of showing me the path to go towards reading and analyzing the Hamzanama paintings more than I have up until now. And I've been actually considering of going back and enrolling myself in a master's in visual arts program at the National College of Arts, where I can learn some miniature painting myself so that I can do that. So that's one thing. And my alternate profession would have been a baker or a cook. And yesterday, the talk kind of made me think, so we were discussing how I'm probably going to leave the dastan aside and start cooking. And yeah, just telling stories about cooking maybe, or painting. Yeah, so it's very interesting how it experience.
Mariam, I was just looking at my friend Doris here, but one of our mutual friends is this, what department is he in English? Yeah, Martin Puchner. Do you know Martin? No, oh, you must. So if you email me or Doris, we'll put you in touch, because he's the master storyteller across all. I mean, that's what he does. You'll really enjoy, and he'll enjoy meeting you as well. So
perfect. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So when Tarun asked that question, what came to my mind was like in terms of disciplinary training, I am sort of a disciplinary orphan in that sense, where I come from development studies, where we are neither sociologists or anthropologists or economics in that sense. So for me to be mentored by Naomi Oreskes, who is at the history of sciences, and at the same time Loretta Michele, who is at the climate sciences, was like one of the most rewarding thing in that sense for me, to get a much more science reading and training in that sense. And secondly, what came to my mind was this, that to think a lot about caste and race in that sense, but of course, caste is not race is not caste in that sense, but to think a lot comparatively about that, and also read a lot of those literature on the environment and race in that sense here in the US, and unlike elsewhere in the North America in that sense. Yeah, so these things were like something which came to my mind. One of the other thing which was there with me was to be like able to write some good poetry here, which I could not do. Like also because like my project is like a book project in that sense. So yeah.
I think for me, one really amazing resource has been Dr. Class, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. With them, I was able to spend a summer, my last summer, with the planning department in Rio de Janeiro. And so I feel like the Latin American context has sort of opened up a new regional imagination for me, which sort of asks similar questions as South Asia, and just to see how those cities operate and what are the sort of logistics of like land markets and land policy, and how it could be translated or how it already works in our cities. I think that's been a really wonderful resource.
I see a hand here first, and then over there. If I miss any hands, just raise them higher or move them faster.
So I had a question more directed to Ajmalkhan. That so for a bit of context, I study water NGOs in India, and one thing I've heard from them recently is that there are equity issues in a lot of the government programs that are rolling out water services. And I'm curious if you what sort of inequities have you seen in government programs that you think are most notable in either in water or in any other sort of area?
Right. Yeah, sure. So of course, thinking about water in India, I mean, we have our relationship towards water is historically evolved, where some section of society did not have access to water in that sense, both water to drink, water to yeah. Now what happens when the policy started in that sense, in the independent India in that sense, a lot of our policies are not informed by these complexities that yeah. So this is the major challenge in that this is not only the problem of water in that sense, but also to do with our forests or all of that. Now specifically with water, we have had a lot of funded projects to kind of bring in access to water in that sense. Now most of those policies, for example, I grew up in Kerala. We had this gigantic project which came in, and in front of my house we have these huge pipes which are still now not being able to use after more than a decade in that sense. So one of the things that I always think about, now this is not specifically about water, but most of our policies are that the existing structures that we have always influence, impact the way in which how we do policy in India. This is a massive challenge in that sense, and how do we tackle this is a massive job in that sense. Also, to have a lot of people, for example, the way in which how the sustainability professionals have increased in the country, let's say in the last maybe less than a decade, speak a very different language altogether. That is not not a local language of access to water, forest, I mean, these were also questions that traditionally raised as Jal Jungle Jameen, for example, by the Adivasis in that sense. So this remains as a fundamental concern.
I think you might need to use the mic that's right there. Thank you.
So my question is to Kheya. Is that how you pronounce your name? Kheya. Well, specifically, I'm interested in, I perceived that, number one, that it doesn't seem like there's nonprofit hospitals there that are run in the private sector. But you mentioned that the private and public health sectors should each cover different sectors of healthcare is the model. But have you taken a look at the model in the US where we have Medicaid managed care by private insurers, which covers everything? And would that possibly be applicable to your situation?
Thank you for that question. So with respect to the program that I've been studying, the publicly insured insurance program, ABPMJ, there are some nonprofit hospitals. They do form a small part of the private sector. So when I say private sector, that includes the nonprofits, but that's a small proportion. With respect to what you asked about Medicaid, Medicare, so yes, PMJ is very much like Medicaid. However, the benefits package and all the policy around it is centrally determined. So while you will have a different kind of Medicaid in every state in the US, in PMJ, because it's central, you get 60% of the funding, or for some states, 90% of the funding comes from the center and the rest comes from the state. So there's a nationally determined benefits package and policy around how it's structured and paid for. And so that's really how it works. And so states can still choose to do things slightly differently. And when I was talking about the public and the private covering different parts, there I was referring to the delivery of care. And what I meant is that there are certain kinds of supply side. So in terms of super specialty care, you sometimes don't have enough capacity in the public sector for those types of care. You have very good public hospitals that can provide it, but they're few and they're not enough to meet population demand. And so in those areas, maybe, is that where we need the private sector? Or is it in the secondary lower levels of care? And those are the answers to which, the questions to which we don't really have very clear answers of which sector provides it most efficiently, through a mechanism where it works, even at the price points at which government is able to pay for these services, right? And so those are really the questions that I'm trying to answer, and this is very market dependent, right? Well, what's the market? Who are the private players in that particular state or even in that district? Sometimes the markets within a state, there'll be a district which is very privately driven, and then there'll be a very rural district that doesn't have many private providers. So what types of care should the public and the private sector be providing in those areas, and what should that mix look like based on market type? So that's really, where we need more, clarity of evidence, really. That's what I was looking at.
Very interesting in consideration of how that might apply to a national health system.
Yeah, it could. Thank you.
Yes.
You guys are fabulous. Can you each give me just one sentence of what you see in each other that's commonality? Commonality of problem, way you approach a solution. You've heard each other. Is there one commonality that you see? One sentence each, 5 sentences.
We all love our work, I'd say.
We're all friends.
I think we built a really, I met Gauri for the first time, but otherwise I think that this cohort of fellows, we share a mutual love for our work and our personalities as well, I think sort of blend well. And I think we pursue our scholarship in a way it's a very important part of our lives. We bring a certain kind of discipline to it, but we also like to have fun. And sorry, that's sorry.
Yeah, just a little more than a sentence. I'm glad you bring this up because it gives me the opportunity to say something that I haven't said, which is that together, really, the Mittal experience with everybody, not just people sitting here, but like scattered around the room, from Hitesh to Danielle and Mirella and everybody else who I'm not naming, Karlin, Salman, Ava, everybody. I'm sorry if I've not mentioned anybody but Dhara and everybody, like strewn across the room, Neha. It's like we're all really one big team. And I wrote to Hitesh the other day that it already feels like home. And it's sad that it's just 6 months because we've just formed this kind of, whether it's because we're all researchers and we have the same kind of imposter syndrome, or whether it is about, we all have that. We are told we are bright, we never believe it, do we? And that kind of that's like a collective kind of reality that we bring together at Mittal, and I think it's just been great. Yeah.
As a sentence to offer.
Sure. A word, resilience. I think that's something that resilience of infrastructure, systems, people, thought, all of that. Yeah.
How many words I'm no, okay. So like I think
That's dangerous.
one sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's full stop.
I think it's about aspiration for more rigorous and like serious scholarship in that sense, and which also like complemented with who we are as like individuals, and like what we like how they were saying like in terms of as a team, like how do we also enjoy our like our times here was something that I felt about.
Yeah, I have a sentence for all four of you. This group has a deep, principled commitment to learning from the particularities of place. The particularities of place. Plus, they're all nice.
And what it means for the world, really. Like, I think, it has implications for the world.
Each of you helped us to see that there's certain things, certain insights that come from being immersed in the South Asian context in various ways. And those insights, although they may come from studying and thinking about South Asia, are not just applicable to South Asia and to the particular problems you're thinking about, but these are insights from which we can all learn. And those insights are very hard won. These are hundreds of hours of work, many of which you wonder what I did the last 99 hours, right? But the insights emerge, and I think that's something that we all heard from you in your own ways, and we were able to see in a little bit, just a small taste of what those insights are and how they get applied to the problems that you're all working on. And I have to say that you make, and the work that you do makes us all better. And so I feel very grateful that you have been able to be here and share your work with us. And also that the Institute, we've done something good in finding ways to bring all of you here with the help of many of the people who are sitting in the audience. So please just join me in thanking everyone. This is just the first we're hearing of them, but it's not going to be the last we hear from them. Thank you.
Right.
Just since we have a lot of friends of the institute here, all of us have been engaged because the university historically has not prioritized South Asia as a region. I think it's a fair statement. And that unfortunately continues to be the case. It's just the nature of elite research universities that move very, very slowly. So we sort of made the strategic decision 5-6 years ago that it's faster to get, and probably wiser to get, a lot of young talent in, so that you create a little bit of a ecosystem of idea exchange. So I think we're starting to get to the point where you've got a critical mass between these folks and the visiting artists and all sorts of other people. I think the Hindi word is adda and the Urdu word is mehfil. Right? So there is a little bit of a cabal of people who get together and bounce ideas off each other. And it doesn't matter that they're in diverse disciplines. I mean, at some level, maybe it would be nice to have clusters, but it's fine as is. And the intent is to, roughly double the size of this in the next couple of years, which is quite doable. So anyway, but thank you very much from my side. Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you. I think for those of you in the audience, you see one of the pleasures of working at the Mittal Institute is to be involved with young scholars like this. It's kind of extraordinary. It's been extraordinary for me as a person. I want to also thank Parimal, whom I called at the last minute and who stepped in. And you see, he's not only one of the world's great Sanskritists, he's also a great moderator and a generous one. Thank you, Parimal. It's worth saying, as Tarun was saying, this is partly made possible through the generosity of a few families, Raghunathans, Balraj, Bajaj, and also Syed Babar Ali Sahab, who make these fellowships possible. And it's very important. And you see the fruits of it here. So thank you all. I want to invite you all to take a short break, have a little coffee, a little cookie, and we'll reassemble in just about 10 minutes for our final, but not the least, the last, and perhaps the most fascinating in some ways, artistic expression in Afghanistan, perspectives from 3 scholars at risk.